Hey everybody, Jay Schlansky here from the Fifth Trooper Network. I just want to take a moment to thank you for checking out this show. Did you know that over at thefifthtrooper.com we have tons of other content, including blogs, other podcasts, all kinds of stuff. In addition, if you want access to exclusive content, you can join us on patreon.com/thefifthtrooper and join at any level and you'll get access to exclusive blog articles, access to our private Discord, and much more. So please check us out, and thank you so much for all your support.
Welcome to the Notorious Scoundrels, a Star Wars Legion podcast bringing you the latest news, general perspective, and competitive discussion.
Hello and welcome back to the Notorious Scoundrels podcast. I'm Kyle. I'm here with Mike and Matt. What's up, gentlemen?
Hey.
Hello, hello.
Matt, is it still cold up there in Norway, or is it like getting less cold now that
it was 8 degrees here yesterday, which I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. It would be like, I don't know, mid 40s, I guess. Sunny.
Yeah, because 0 is 32.
Exactly. So right. And it's 1.8 degrees, so maybe even a bit. Maybe high 40s, maybe closer to 50. So I mean, it's coastal Norway in the south, relatively speaking. It's a very long, skinny country. There's it just keeps going up, up, up. It has a border with Russia if you go far enough, which is not necessarily what you want to have these days, but that's a different topic. So there are definitely much colder places in Norway than where I live, luckily.
I will admit that at least like 30% of my Scandinavian geographical knowledge comes from playing Axis and Allies, which may not be entirely accurate, because at least in Axis and Allies, Norway does not border Russia. That's Finland.
Finland has a much more important border, especially in World War II. Yeah.
All I know is you can't go straight from Norway to Russia, but maybe that's incorrect.
It's a land border, but it's very it's like in the Arctic Circle, like at the very tippy top, because basically Norway goes it loops kind of above the other Nordic countries by the end. And I'll just to be 100% sure I'm not spitting wrong information on the podcast, let me pull up Google
No,
Maps.
you're totally right. And
okay,
I know this because I've dabbled in a game that I don't think is very good, but was very interesting in Hearts of Iron, and I decided to play Norway.
Hang on, don't you disparage Hearts of Iron. Hearts of Iron is amazing.
It is a bad game, but
which version did you play? Which one?
Just the base, the latest one, Hearts of Iron 4 or whatever. It's not a game. It's a logistics simulator.
It is a simulation.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. I like this sound now.
It doesn't actually like the fighting of the battles and stuff isn't actually any fun. There's no fun in the battle portion of it. It's just okay. I mean,
maybe your problem is that you played as Norway instead of
I've attempted to play it a couple other times, but I was like, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna try and turn Norway into a superpower. And I declared war on Sweden, and we lost really badly after prepping for 3 years.
I think Norway's military power kind of went really downhill after probably the 1400s, I would want to say. I don't know. Once Vikings weren't the best thing around, it just really turned south.
I think my issue with the game is that it doesn't really allow you to do the things that are cool and interesting, because it tries to bound you within the realism of the real world. The fact that it takes 4 years to build an aircraft carrier makes it so that it's just I'm not building an alternate reality. I'm just running the simulator of the thing that really happened, and I don't need to do that. I can just read a textbook.
Well, I quite enjoyed it back in the day. I definitely got mileage out of it. I would not go back to it. It's not something that you play more than once or twice, at least in my case. But I enjoyed it the first couple times I did it. I played as the UK and then I played as Japan. And those were both interesting playthroughs. So anyway, each to their own. It is definitely a simulation. It is by the same company that makes Stellaris and
I
Europa
love Stellaris.
Universalis and Crusader Kings, so Paradox is it definitely feels the most like simulation-y of those various games. Where they really like you said, it doesn't take 4 years, but it does take a long time to build ships because ships
It's
take a long time to
absurd.
build.
It's just like not fun. I don't know. Like
Yeah.
I'm like, man, I
You get
want to
you
build a fleet and attack my faraway neighbor, and you don't get to do it until the game is over, basically.
It depends on who you are. Like if you're a nation that actually starts with ships, you can also go all the way back to like 1930 something and start then. But
Yeah.
you got to do some pre-planning. You got to hit the fast forward button a couple times.
A lot of times,
A lot of times.
frankly.
Yeah.
There's a lot of skipping things in that game, which I
Yeah.
think might speak for itself.
All right. How about we talk about Legion?
Yeah. A game where we don't skip things.
Yes, and
No,
where
though
it
you
doesn't
might
take 4 years to build a unit
you might
because
want to
you don't
just
do that
skip
at
to
all.
turn 6 on some games with how they play out.
Oh,
Fast forward, fast forward, fast
stop
forward.
it.
Oh.
Turns out that how big the board is and how long the game is are things that really matter in this game. So
Yeah. So we're going to talk today about this is from a listener suggested topic on our Discord. We're going to talk about gunlines today. This one, let's see if I can see this. Who this was suggested by? Levity Games on the Discord. So if you want to suggest topics to us or ask questions or whatever, you can do that on our Fifth Trooper Discord, which you can access by just doing like $1 a month for Patreon. So anyway, we're going to talk about gunlines today. We're going to try and do like a deep tactics dive on it. This is something that we have done, I'm sure, at some point in the prior 6 years of this podcast, but we're going to do it again because we're dealing with different units now, and we've got 2 new units coming out in commandos and range troopers in just a few weeks that are like clearly token gunline units and are likely to push the game even further in that direction than it already is. So it's worth having a like more in-depth strategic discussion about that. But first, we have a news item, which is that Adepticon for next year, 2025 Adepticon, will be not in Chicago suburbs, not in Schaumburg. It will be in Milwaukee, which is in Wisconsin, for those that may not be familiar with United States geography. Yeah, it's not actually that far from Chicago. It's like an hour and 15 minutes, basically.
yeah, we were already sort of like 20 minutes from Chicago, technically.
Yeah, maybe even closer to like 35 to 40, actually, depending on what part of Chicago. But yeah, Schaumburg was already
It's like a 20-minute drive from the airport. That's
right. Yes.
Yeah.
Schaumburg is west of Chicago. Milwaukee is, of course, north of Chicago, quite a bit further, but it's not like you can still fly into O'Hare and then, you'd probably want to like share an Uber or a rental car or something to get up to Milwaukee. You can also fly directly into Milwaukee, but it's not nearly as big of an airport as O'Hare. So definitely some travel considerations there for next year. I will say, I am personally a little bit sad because I have family in the Chicago suburbs. So I was always able to do this as like a dual purpose trip, bring my kids, bring the wife, have them stay at my parents, go do the con and then do like a spring break thing afterwards. And that's going to be more difficult with this setup. So personally, that's like less ideal for me. It will be nice to have restaurants and stuff that are walkable from the convention center because my understanding is that it's in downtown Milwaukee.
It is. Yeah, is it the Baird Center, I
The
think
Baird
it's
Center,
called?
yes.
Which apparently just had like a very, very expensive renovation, based on their website. And I think there's a couple key notes here, I think, for next year's Adepticon. The first is the Baird Center does not have a hotel in it, which means that this is more of a pack situation where the hotel you're staying at and the place we're playing are going to be separate entities.
Yeah.
I'm sure there will probably, I don't even know. There might not be room blocks, I don't know. I don't know how like PAX and stuff handles that sort of thing, but I don't think PAX has room blocks for stuff, right? Not that I'm aware
I don't
of, at
know.
least.
Yeah. We did an
Um,
Airbnb for PAX last time, so
yeah, that was really weird. Not because of the people, to be very
yeah.
clear. It
It
was
was,
just
it
a
was a Philadelphia
really,
experience.
really weird Airbnb. That's all I'm gonna say.
That whole weekend was one long Philadelphia experience.
Yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, so there's that, and because of that, I mean it's gonna be downtown. So parking's potentially an issue. I don't know.
Potentially, there are a lot of parking garages down there, but
That's
it's
fair.
it's not going to be like it's unlikely to be a big free situation like Schaumburg was.
Yeah, yeah. I think this likely will make it a little more expensive, though maybe because it's in Milwaukee, the rooms will be cheaper or something. I don't know.
You also might not need to park anywhere if you just Uber from the airport and then can walk from your hotel to the convention center.
That's
So,
very true.
we'll see how that all shakes out. But yeah, I mean, the bottom line is Adepticon was too big for the Renaissance. They had already kind of shunted the like historical games and stuff like that over to another site. I believe the Hyatt, maybe. That was not far from the Renaissance, but it had already kind of been like sprawling over two hotel convention center locations. And I think part of the goal with this was to just get everything, because I think they said something like 8,000 people attended Adepticon this year. And I think the goal is to just get everyone back in one spot and just have one giant thing like PAX. So, I can definitely see where they're coming from. Personally, a little bit bummed because Chicago is my jam. Um, you know, Milwaukee doesn't have the good deep dish and hot dogs. They do have very good beer though. Milwaukee known for its breweries. So there's that.
The only Milwaukee beer I know is like the Milwaukee's Best or whatever. It's like
do not
$4 for a
do
12
not
pack or
judge. Yeah, do
whatever.
not judge Milwaukee based on Milwaukee's best. It is not Milwaukee's best.
Just
So
terrible.
yeah.
Sorry if you like that beer, but it's really bad.
Yeah, that's like
Uh,
that's like a token cheap as possible American beer. Um,
it's like worse than the like Coors Lights and Coronas,
yes.
and like it's like, yeah. Um, yeah, so I am glad that we got everybody like deep dish and hot dogs. I hadn't done the Portillo's thing until this year, so um it was good to get that out of the way because apparently we're never doing it again.
There you go. I mean, you could always drive down to Chicago area, I guess, if you were really desperate for it, or stop on the way from O'Hare if you're flying into O'Hare. So,
I
you know,
suppose.
anyway, yeah. So there's that. We'll see how it ends up being, but they were too big for Schaumburg, so they're relocating. I'm sure the people that run Adepticon are very good business people. So obviously they've been doing this very successfully for a while. So um,
It will be a
yeah,
little sad too, at least for me, from my perspective. It's kind of like it's not like going home in a sense, but it's familiar. It's very nice. And it's like you go back to that hall and it's like, oh yes, I'm back, baby. Here
We're in the
I am back in
same
North America,
yeah,
we're in the same
somewhere I
like
remember. So
couple
now it will just
thousand
be,
square feet.
yeah. There'll
yeah,
be a
it'll just be a
nostalgia
different
piece
place.
that's a little missing from that.
But on the other hand, I can tell people, yeah, I'm going to Milwaukee and actually like experience Milwaukee a bit more than saying, yeah, I'm going to Chicago, but not really,
But not
not
really.
at all. Yeah,
Yeah. I'm actually going to a suburb where you have to get into a car to go anywhere.
yeah.
And yeah. Yeah, it's not quite the same. So, and Schauberg, very similar to a lot of other American suburbs,
Yes.
Yep.
frankly. So, yeah, it'll be interesting. It'll be a different place to create new nostalgia.
Hmm.
So, all right. Should we get into gunlines?
Yeah, let's do
I'm
it.
down.
So when you guys first, why don't we define what that is? Because there are different types of Legion lists. What do you guys think of when you think of like when somebody says a gun line? What is it that you're thinking of? What qualifies as a gun line in Legion?
I think it's a list where a bulk of the list, not all of the list, because it's usually you can have gunline plus X, whether that's some speeders or a force user or bounty hunters, whatever. But you've got multiple units that are all kind of contributing their main firepower, generally at range 3, right? If it gets to range 2, I'd call that more of an aggro list. Like I wouldn't call Black Suns uh, a gun line. I'd say more range 3. Range 4 exists in gun lines, but it hasn't really been the main operating range, I would say, until now. Like it's always been good, but often you kind of have to at some point move to range 3 to really uh turn up the heat, I would say. So it's a lot about range control rather than closing range as quickly as possible.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's important to note that the units in your list, while they define whether you're a gunline or not, the types of units, I think like Matt said, can vary. Like you can have vehicles in your list and still be a gunline. Like I would like Tempest Force is obviously not a gunline, but like a list with like one ATST in it and a bunch of shooters is still a gunline, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the ATST does not divert from that game plan, right? It's
Yeah.
still, it's still a big shooter, just the same way as like a saber tank would be. So
I kind of think of Gunline as like a character. It's like an expensive character, but it's a character in that list. So you can have Gunline, as Mike says, plus ATST, or you can hard swap that ATST for Vader, and it'll play very relatively differently, but you still have that Gunline, or you can go with speeders, very different. It's kind of like a block of the army, but even though it takes up maybe half the points or so or more, it's not the whole army.
yeah, and I think for maybe our purposes here, it turns into a gun line when you start using, I think, the types of strategies we're going to talk about here with it. Like it becomes kind of a gun line because it uses these strategies well, right? And that's not to say that you definitely could run the same units in almost the same configurations, and you could run them not as a gun line. Like I think I'd almost like to divorce the idea of a gun line having way less to do with the units in your list and more about how you play the list. It like gunline is more of a strategy than an army composition. There are army compositions that are really good at playing like gunline. And we see people take them all the time and we call them gunlines. But I think for like what we're trying to talk about, gunline is more of how you move your perhaps core of your army around the board to support each other.
Gunline's a state of mind, is what
It's
you're
a state of
saying.
mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's define that state of mind. What is it? What is the gunline state of mind? What strategies are you talking about that would define what you're doing when you're moving units around and such as a gunline?
Yeah, so I think like Matt alluded to, the primary mode of a gun line is controlling, operating, and threatening range bands, as opposed to it. The main goal of it is not to just like get up there and start shooting, though it can be. The main thing is you are going to use your unit's ranges to project power onto the board by threatening move shoot shots, basically, which is generally roughly range 4 from your unactivated units. And you're going to use that power to basically say, hey, opponent, you can't go here. Or if you do, you're going to start a fight that you're going to be disadvantaged in when you start it.
Now, something important you said there that I want to touch on real quick is you said basically range 4. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I say basically range 4 because a move shoot is obviously like a little bit less than range 4.
With a range 3 unit.
With a range 3 unit.
Yeah.
Obviously, the new units that are coming out in range troopers and clone commandos will maybe change that dichotomy a little bit, because they're probably going to be pretty prevalent, and they're probably going to make some of what we're talking about today be more of a discussion around the move shoot at the range 5 kind of interval, with those particular units. But yeah, so the range 4 band, obviously the move shoot is like a little bit less than range 4, but for most practical purposes it is range 4, unless you're getting down into the nitty gritty of exact, people are measuring out so that they're exactly range 4 from your units, which if it's happening, you need to know that you're not within a move shoot of those units. But
and the whole exact range is pretty big, specifically in gunline play, because it is about that range control. If I'm running with a gunline up against Black Suns who are charging my face, I don't want to move well within range 3. I want to move to exactly range 3 if I can, because I don't want those Black Suns to move and shoot back at range 2. Right? If against ideally with a gunline, in a sense, you can have a range advantage so that you're in a situation where you're shooting them and not getting shot back.
The ideal situation.
The ideal, exactly.
Yeah, and the same is true if you've got your range 4 units versus their range 3 units.
Yeah.
Right? So you always want to be conscious of like what the general threat ranges of your units are versus your opponents. And you could be both running a strategy that is like a gunline strategy, but you might have different range bands that you're working with. Range 2, as we said, is more of an aggro thing, but the difference between range 3 and range 4 is kind of big. And there are gunline strategies and lists that kind of focus on that range 3 band. Most of those are Republic ones. And those lists are gonna, like you got to be hyper aware if you're in one of those matchups where whether it's you or your opponent is that range 3 Republic gunline, and another might be like a range 4 Empire one, right? Because Empire and Rebels too really tend to be better at like stacking range 4 / even range 5 units.
Yes.
Relative to Republic and droids. Obviously, experimental droids kind of messes with that a little bit because your units can spontaneously move range 3.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which messes with the range bands a lot. But yeah, particularly with 2 like strong looking range 4 units coming out, that difference between range 3 and range 4 is going to be big in this gunline dynamic.
One of the critical differences, especially, is turn 1, because for a lot of deployments, especially the ones that gunlines tend to use, where they're a bit further apart, there's a bit more opportunity for range control. The closest you start on something like major offensive, especially, or even battle lines, stuff like that, or advanced positions changes because of scout, but you start at range 4 often, at the very closest, which means a range 3 army is not bringing their full firepower to bear on turn 1, versus a range 4 army can.
Do we want to talk about timing and like unit tempo and such with respect to gunline play?
Sure, go for it.
So this goes hand in hand with being aware of all the range bands of your opponent's units. Basically, you want to be in a position where if your opponent like moves up and shoots your frontmost unit, you can then move up and shoot that unit that shot your unit with as many units as possible. Hopefully while avoiding the same thing happening then to your units that are moving up and shooting. One of the common mistakes I see new players make is they'll just kind of like move up. They'll want to be engaging, and they'll just kind of move up a unit to shoot one of your units without like really pre-planning where the units behind that unit are going and whether or not they're going to be able to like cover it. And then they end up with basically one unit out there where the rest of their opponent's army can kind of just move up like just barely within range of that one unit that moved up and shot, and they can shoot that unit with minimal retaliation.
It's like having a hanging piece in chess.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes,
Generally
exactly.
speaking, when you're advancing with your gun line, you want to take the units that are furthest back and move them up first. Because if you take a unit that's far forward and you move a full speed, let's say most units are speed 2. If you move speed 2 forwards to shoot, the next unit will end up behind them. So you always want to be kind of keeping everyone within one move of each other and moving the back guys to overlap the front, and then move those guys in front and in front slowly, so that exactly what Kyle's saying is happening. If they shoot the frontmost unit, everyone behind is within a move shoot of retaliation.
Yeah, and I definitely think when we talk about Kyle, in your example, you used, they move up with a unit and they shoot with it, and then you just kind of like open up on it. I think that that's definitely like on like a fundamental level, like that's definitely the easiest way to operate a gun line. You're like, I'm going to shoot the thing that is closest to me so I don't have to move towards it, right?
Right.
I think the conversation does get a little bit more complicated when we're talking about units that are all very close together, that are your opponents, and all of your units are very close together. And all of a sudden you have the option of, yes, they moved up with a unit that has already shot, and there's a unit like maybe 2 inches behind it that you could shoot that unit, and it is unactivated and it is going to participate because they've already signaled to you that they've started the fight, right? They have thrown a unit up there and shot early in the turn with a bunch of unactivated units behind it. They're signaling to you with that they're coming, right? So taking dice off the table before the dice get rolled, like the best defense is a good offense, like it applies in Legion in a very real way. And shooting unactivated units, even if it perhaps puts your units in a higher threat bubble, once the battle has started, is a lot of times okay, as long as you're still within kind of a contained, everybody's able to step up and protect each other bubble.
And the other thing too, not only are you taking dice off the table, but in some circumstances you're taking action economy away. If I move up and shoot you, perhaps you are not going to be able to move up and shoot me back, depending on relative ranges.
And suppression.
Because of suppression, exactly, which some units care about quite a lot. Looking at clone commandos, if you hit them, if they get suppressed, they're very sad. Droids, if you're playing EXD, are not going to care all that much. So it's suppression is in a
suppression
weird spot. Yeah, it turns out ignoring suppression strong. Who would have thought? Yeah.
Well, it is no coincidence that Courage 1 core units, like with just a heavy and no personnel upgrades or other things that help mitigate that, Courage 1 are extremely rare in competitive Legion. And it's because with the possible exception of phase 1s.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say the only reason they're not rare in public armies is because they can fire support.
Yes.
And that's it.
And usually if you have some phase 1s in your army, it's either because you can't afford to upgrade them to captain phase 1s or phase 2s, or they serve like a very specific fire support purpose. Like you've got an RPS that's a phase 1 and all they have is an RPS and their job is to fire support. But it's pretty unusual these days to see like an entire army where you have 3 to 6 core units that are all Courage 1 without some kind of compel or other significant suppression mitigation tool. Because if you get shot just one time and you get one suppression, and that can effectively deny that whole unit's turn if they're outranged in the first place, right? Like if a unit gets shot by something that's range 4 and it's a range 3 unit, even if you're not talking about the exact range 4 thing, they still might not be able to move up and shoot. And that's not only is that denying the one action from the suppression, but since they're not in a spot where they need to be to like attack, which is generally the most impactful thing that a unit can do, you're sort of canceling their whole turn with just that one suppression.
I mean, this is a little bit hyperbolic, but you're kind of killing that unit for the turn.
Yes.
As far as it participating in the gunline fight that's going to happen, if you can put a suppression token on it without it being able to shoot you back, there is a 66% chance that it does not get to help whatever unit is hanging out in front, right? So it's a really big deal.
For sure. And I'm glad you bring up the 66% chance, because one of the things I wanted to mention is, courage doesn't scale linearly in a sense, like the effects compound on one another because of how the math works. So a courage 1 unit with 1 suppression, as Mike said, 2/3 chance that it's going to keep that suppression. A courage 2 unit with 2 suppression, it's 50-50. It's like 55-45. And I think 55 is that you will actually roll it off.
Yes.
Yeah. It's much more likely that you take your action.
Yeah. So it's even though both situations are I have suppression equal to my courage, that extra courage value helps a lot. Or just be Joyce again and have effectively infinite courage.
In the same way, suppressive weapons or the things that do more than 1 suppression at a time also have sort of a scaling, like diminishing returns, in terms of almost like in the reverse. Because if you do 2 suppression to a courage 1 unit, that second suppression is like it significantly reduces their chance to go down to 0, right? From 33 to 11. But if you hit a courage 2 unit with those 2 suppression, it raises the chance that they might get 1 action instead of 2 from 0 to 44%. So like against the courage 2 unit, you're really banking that suppressive keyword. Like you're getting 100% more value out of that out of that shot than you would be by just shooting it with a normal weapon that has just 1 suppression and therefore no chance to cause that unit to lose actions. So I know that, like, one of the things we've talked about previously on this cast is suppression mitigation power creep, if you will, and that, like, when the game first came out, default for pretty much all units that weren't characters was courage 1. Over time, we started getting more courage 2 units. Those were primarily like special forces, and then over time, we've got more and more ways to mitigate suppression and the impacts of suppression. And now we're in a position where you can run like an entire list effectively without taking any courage 1 units. And that wasn't a thing before.
In every faction.
In every faction. And people are like, well, this makes suppression bad. This makes suppressive weapons bad. And in relative terms, it actually increases the value of suppressive weapons, relative to like normal weapons, right? Because if your opponent's entire list is courage 2 units, normal weapons have no chance at all in 1 shot to reduce their actions, but a suppressive weapon still does. So I think it's still very much worth taking suppressive weapons. I think the range troopers, I've seen some people poo-pooing the suppressive weapon there. I actually think that could be a real difference maker in how effective they are, particularly against clone commandos, which is going to be a real common matchup.
Yeah.
That's so maybe it's a bit of a side tangent, but I think it really comes down to meta is the problem. I don't think it's the problem is the suppressive gun is very good. It's whether or not you lose impact. And that's kind of a thing with gun lines as well. Like these are thoughts because a lot of the points you have are going into this gun line, it also has to solve a decent amount of issues for you when it comes to meta matchups. So with something like range troopers, you're spending a lot of points, you're focusing a lot on them. My worry is if you don't make the range troopers have impact, you just lose to armor. But maybe commandos chase armor out anyways. So
I think
it depends, but
I think that's a good segue though into one of the reasons gun lines are powerful, but they are also susceptible to getting sort of skewed out is that gun lines, because they're projecting power and range, that power and range is only effective at being projected if it's actually effective, right? Like, and so
if you're actually damaging what you're shooting at, you
right?
mean?
If you're actually, doing damage to whatever you're doing. So like, if your opponent brings much armor and you have no impact in your gun line doesn't actually do its job, right? Like in that matchup, your gun line cannot operate the way that your strategy and your build is trying to operate on the table. So I think Matt, you bring up a good point in that, you do need to bring the keywords that allow you to be flexible, whether that is impact because your meta has armor, or whether that's suppressive because people are running a bunch of courage to core units, or whatever,
or mobility because of speeders. Because I think I like that you mentioned it can get skewed out, and I feel like that can happen in a few different ways. Because we've talked about armor, where, hey, as someone who ran full armor Dark Troopers quite recently, feels great when someone rolls 10 hits and they all go away, right? It takes that effectiveness and it just chops off a lot of hits right off the bat. So that's one way. But then you've got, speeder and mobility lists, the kind of lists that very traditionally are taking things like bombing run, breakthrough, that try to make the game about other things than projecting power at range. In some ways, right? With high mobility units and bombing, dropping bombs, that kind of stuff. And then you've got kind of aggro lists, which try to change the game in the sense of, the game isn't about positioning at longer ranges. I'm just going to close the gap very quickly and to a spot where I can out firepower you. So a gun line, you kind of want to have plans at least, and some sort of answers for all those different ways that, people could skew away. Because I think maybe it's wrong to say that a gun line is like, it's not a default list, but take a bunch of guns is certainly an element of a lot of different lists in Legion. So it's kind of a middle ground in some senses, but it can be worked around in quite a few ways.
I mean, ultimately, Legion is a miniatures game set in basically like a sci-fi analog of World War II. So it shouldn't be surprising that making ranged attacks is one of the primary ways that you engage with your opponent. Because that's kind of central to the identity of what the game is, which I think is fine personally. You can have lots of fun that way. Do we want to talk? There's a couple other things relevant to gunline play I think we should talk about, and those are cohesion and cover, slightly related to each other. Should we hit those real quick?
Yeah,
sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So cohesion, of course, refers to dropping your dudes near your unit leader. There are some things that you definitely should not do with cohesion. Some of this is going to be like a little 101. You're giving me a side eye, Mike.
You're using the word definitely, and I suspect some of the things.
I don't want to say 100% of the time.
Okay. I think definitely implies 100% of the time, I guess.
Okay.
Is what I'm suggesting.
General rules of thumb.
There you go.
Know the rule before you break the rule. Know when to break the rule.
There you go. Right. Thank you, Matt. That was perfectly phrased.
That's what I do.
I guess the reason I'm bringing it up is because I actually think that using some of the things that you're about to say don't use are actually intrinsic to how gunlines work.
Okay, well, let's talk about forward cohesion first.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, did I walk right into that one?
You definitely did.
So forward cohesion refers to when you put guys closer to your opponent's units than your unit leader is, thereby giving your opponent a chance to shoot your unit without, like, accessing a ranged attack, accessing a range band on your unit that they cannot access back. So if you drop a guy in front of your unit leader, and you've got a range 3 unit and your opponent has a range 3 unit, if your opponent moves to range 3 of the model that you dropped in front of your unit leader, they will be able to shoot your unit, and your unit will not be able to shoot them back without moving. So that's kind of like a rule of thumb, if you will, of gunline play, is that you want to make sure you're cohering your non-leader minis behind your unit leader relative to where your opponent's units are. So what situations would you want to ignore that rule of thumb, Mike?
Yeah, so I actually think there's quite a few these days.
Okay.
Basically, if your opponent's playing a Wookiee skew, if they're playing a Geonosian skew, if they're playing a Black Sun skew, all of those
are range 2.
Range 2 skew,
yeah.
fundamentally. Which all of those things that I just mentioned are things that people are playing right now.
Yes.
Right? Like they are things that are regularly seen on the table. Forward cohering your models forward and taking a standby when you don't have any eligible targets is actually a pretty good place to be, because if they're triggering your standby, you can shoot them. If you couldn't
increases
shoot
the
them
range.
before.
Yeah, it increases the standby threat range of your unit.
Yes, it increases it, and yeah, because a lot of those armies are intrinsically trying to make it so that you can't shoot them because they're standing behind line of sight blockers.
Right.
And if you are cohering models forward with your standbys, it allows you to, again, it's all about threat range projection. It allows you to project your threat range of your units that normally wouldn't be able to do anything from range 2 to range 2 plus 4 inches, right? So that is a big deal in those specific
because
matchups.
it keeps them further away. If their
Keeps them further
objective is
away.
don't get shot,
Yeah.
it keeps them 4 inches further away, which 4 inches can be a big deal to some of us. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't keep them 4 inches further away from your opponent because you are cohering a model 4 inches closer to them. But it
Yes,
does
but then you can
push
pull that
pushes
back.
your standby range out by 4 inches.
But it means as well
Yeah.
too, if you want to, the next turn, if they're just outside range 2 of that model, you can move and then cohere that model back away. So effectively, you've moved away from them much faster than you would have otherwise as
Right.
well. So maybe that's more that's when you're going to realize the 4 inches. Or if they get a shot off and kill one guy, you kill that guy, and now you've gained 4 inches. So you can gain that distance back. But yes, not right away, because you do have a guy.
You can always
Deploy
move with a
forward.
standby too instead of attacking.
You
So
absolutely can, right?
It
if
can
you're
call your bluff.
A lot of people
If
forget that.
Oh
yeah.
yes.
They're like, oh, you moved. I can't shoot you now.
Yeah,
Nope.
it's like, all right, I'm gonna move up with this Black Sun unit. I guess I'm gonna eat this standby shot, and then I'll shoot your unit for a bunch. And then you're like, I moved back, and then
Yeah.
they're like, oh,
Now my Black
okay,
Sun's out in the middle of nowhere.
yeah,
And is
And
about to
because I
get
thought I
shot
was
by
going to
everything
trade.
else, right?
hmm
Yeah.
And
yeah,
so like presenting some of those like bluff plays also, that's probably a little bit too complicated to get into in the weeds on.
Yeah.
But those sorts of
The
things are effective.
the other thing that's important with forward cohesion, which might be a bit more relevant these days because of clone commandos and their range 3 to 4 gun, is minimum ranges. Um,
yep,
where you can cohere forwards and hit the minimum range of a weapon. So, maybe a classic example would be like a mortar, a shore mortar. If you cohere just barely into range 2 of that mortar, now it can no longer shoot you for 2 suppression, which may be relevant in the current game state. This is a trick, not really gunline play, but as an example, this is a trick I actually use a decent amount with like dark troopers. Cohere forwards, get in range 1 of my opponent's RPS clone troopers, because it's a range 2 to 4 gun. And now, hey, look at all that impact. A lot of impact guns have minimum ranges, or Bosk or something. Though Bosk is pretty easily just going to move back and shoot you, whereas an
right.
RPS can't. So now with commandos, then they can shoot you with their range 2 gun, but that doesn't have pierce or high velocity, so maybe it's a good trade-off. It depends.
Yeah, I think that trick is also very useful for kind of shirking like bombards and stuff, like forcing
Yep.
the characters that are bombarding to like move even farther back, or maybe you're so close that they can't bombard you at all. And bombard being the range 4 to infinity, generally command card effects, command card attacks from like Leia, Veers. There's a
Blizzard Force, the generic
faction specific
Yeah, the
ones.
generic super attack, air support.
It's not a super attack
Yeah.
card. It's
Yeah,
a
that's
separatist
just
card, but the super attacks are very good
It's
with it.
funny
Yeah.
because it's always a super attack using
Yeah.
it,
What do you
but
know?
it is a generic separatist one.
Yep.
Geonosians can't use it though.
Yeah, Poggle can't call in that strike apparently.
Yeah.
So a little bit annoying, but is what it is. Yeah, so that's forward cohesion. should we talk about, I mean, there's other considerations with cohesion cover. You should always just kind of be aware, uh, where the cover is in between you and your opponent's units, and generally you want to cohere stuff towards that cover. If doing so doesn't, give your opponents free shots for your forward cohesion. So we're talking about, unless you're doing something specific with forward cohesion, like taking standbys, you still want to be behind that like plane uh, between your unit leader and your opponent's units, but cohering units off to the side. Like range 1 is pretty far.
So
4 inches
yeah.
is pretty far. So you can often throw your unit leader in a spot where maybe that unit leader doesn't have cover, but then you kind of throw dudes either to the left or to the right of him, and then they do have cover.
Yeah. Or behind is, often the big thing. Put your leader in front of a
Yes.
barricade, put everyone behind. That way you can move and it's not difficult terrain.
That's
Right.
a huge deal. I see people doing that all the time where they're like, I want to get cover. So they put their unit leader like behind the difficult terrain so they have to move around it. And it's just like, guys.
No.
Yeah. Go to the side of the difficult terrain or in front of it and put your dudes behind the difficult terrain.
Yeah, 100% of the time. Like I guess if you lose the rest of the unit, you'll be in light cover as opposed to heavy because you'll have a suppression and all your guys are dead, but you got bigger problems.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
If he's the only one left, so um yeah, that's because movement is essential in making your gun line operate. If you can't get those units to move their full distance so that you have the flexibility to project the threat ranges and get out if you need to, and you're slowed down because you like kind of position yourself poorly, that's a no-go.
That's a good, I feel like I want to expand on that, but before there is one more thing on cohesion as well, that I think is useful to bring up, and that's if you have, there's a lot of I'd say like aura effects, like hey, if you're in range 1 of this, if you're in range 2, generally speaking, for me, especially because sniping, you can't like line up a shot on a heavy and just take the heavy out before anything else anymore. So the positioning of the heavy matters less. But generally speaking, I want to put the heavy in cover and I want to put it in range. More importantly, I want to have it be in range of all the aura effects.
I almost think it matters more now where the heavy goes specifically.
Yes, it matters more for all of that versus I have to line it up to not get terrain scope. Like it mattered a lot in very specific circumstances before, because if you got your heavy scope, that sucked, but it didn't come up not that often versus stuff like barrier, clone token sharing, that's coming up all the time. So you want to make sure that you don't want to be in a situation where it's like, dang, either I kill my heavy so I can stay within token sharing range, or I don't kill the heavy and have an effective unit, but now I'm out of token sharing range.
Yes. The heavy should always be the fulcrum of what all those things are pivoting on, because it's going to be the last thing you want to pick up off the tape.
If it's not the unit leader, which often it can't be because of where your unit leader is.
Obviously if it's echo, then
Well, and I just mean like obviously unit leaders that are also heavies, but I'm talking about like if you can put your unit leader at range 1 of your other clones or at range 2 of Padme or whatever, if your droids, if you put your unit leader at range 1 of your coordinate chain, then obviously he's the last one to die and it matters less where your heavy is. But there's going to be a lot of situations where you're kind of relying on cohesion to maintain those internal ranges within your line. And if you're doing that, you want to make sure that the heavy is the guy that is doing that.
Yeah, because often you're using that cohesion instead of the unit leader to make that range 1 bubble much larger, or those range 2 bubbles or whatever. That's the thing, like range 2 plus cohesion, range 1 plus cohesion, as we've kind of said, is once you start factoring that in, especially when it's like one full unit to another, where it's like one unit can cohere to the left and the other unit coheres to the right, those effects that seem like they might affect a small area affect a lot. But
yeah, and I mean, this is more of a clone specific thing, but when I move my 5-man trooper units, my go-to move is I move the unit leader and then I immediately take like a 45-degree angle off either side of him, and I just put the first two models I cohere the farthest away I can from the unit leader in either direction, so that I'm extending my bubble as far as it possibly can go.
Exactly.
And I
lot
think
of
that's
it's
a
just
very good baseline for people that are trying to play clones.
a lot of that's just kind of future proofing. Like, hey, maybe
Yep.
I don't even plan to go out to this side, but just in case. But the thing you got to be aware of, and this kind of comes back into counterplay and why sometimes another reason why speeder lists, maybe less so now with the cover change rules, but why they can take advantage of this is flanking. I mean, things that aren't speeders can also flank, but generally speeders
It's a
are
lot
good
harder.
at it because they're fast.
Yeah.
They can kind of get that situation that Kyle was talking about where they can hit the guy from the side, maybe at range 3, but be outside range 3 of your unit leader. If you're facing each other, then cohering out to the sides doesn't really matter because they're going to hit the unit leader first. But if someone can get around to the side, then all of a sudden that opens up that possibility. And sometimes it doesn't take all that much. Like if you're kind of fighting at angles, even with gun lines, if you 45 degrees is a good kind of rule of thumb there, I think, because it's pretty hard to come and
It's
fight. But if
hard
you
to
go
shirk
like
that. But
if you go
if you're like
almost
at the same
horizontal,
plane, yeah,
and
it's
sometimes it happens because of like space or you're trying to really clump up behind a barricade. Like it happens sometimes where you've got maybe your unit leader and then you've got a guy kind of like right behind him. That even other gun lines can kind of just like shift slightly and hit that guy occasionally, and you don't really want that to happen because then you're losing out on action efficiency. That's a big thing for gun lines. Mike kind of touched on it with movement. It's funny because I think people think of gun lines and they think, they want to sit there and aim shoot, which is true. If they can sit and aim shoot, they feel great.
that's like
But
if you're aim shooting, you're already living the dream. But like it's
you're living the dream,
yeah.
exactly. But often movement is king because again, it's about range control. And what's better than having good defense dice is not rolling
any. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, to maybe talk a little bit about last episode, this is the part of the gunline thing that makes experimental so
Yes. Experimental is a
absolutely
great
dangerous.
They exemplify gunline play in I think multiple ways, all because of the surge token sharing or spending. So yeah, go ahead on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of movement, just the ability to basically if they spend a speed 3 move to move backwards, all of a sudden they're not only like probably shooting you before they do that and placing a suppression token on your unit that could potentially move up and try and shoot them, but they're moving so far back with the speed 3 that you actually, even if you could move, you're not going to get to them to shoot.
Mhm.
And so, and conversely, they can be outside of your threatened engagement range bubble, move into it and past it, and shoot you at range 3. Which is why they have, I think, they rip the gun lines apart at Worlds because they break some of these rules in ways that are very critical.
Yes, they're very good at the range band control because a range band 6 inches is pretty much for small base troopers, again, pretty much a speed 2 move. So that speed 3, you're moving more than a range band. But also in the situation of where things are going great and you're not having to move, they also have the token efficiency, which is, I think, a big thing that you see that makes modern, gun lines click, where you've got free tokens out the wazoo,
They're
surges,
not
aims.
free, but they are tokens.
They're free in a sense. Some tokens are more free than others.
Yeah.
Again, EXD gets them for just existing, so they're free in
Mhm.
the sense that if you use these list building restrictions, you get them a few freebies every turn. But in that situation, they can just say, "Oh, well, okay, I don't need to become speed 3, so hey, why not? I'll take another aim for lethal. I'll take extra dice." So they lean into kind of both sides. If they need to be static, they can be very good at being static, and if they need to be moving, they can be very good at moving because also um, BX droids have scale, so
Yep.
they don't get slowed down by terrain, which can be very important. You can put your unit leader behind the terrain, the difficult
put him behind the
terrain
barricade.
if you
Sure,
want,
why not?
because who cares? You walk over at a full speed.
Yeah. Should we talk real quick about cover? Because we've been sort of talking about it, tangentially to these other topics, but I think it's worth explicitly talking about it. When is it worthwhile to, like, if possible, move to take an out of cover shot versus just staying where you are and aiming and shooting, or even shooting and then moving?
Sorry, what do you mean out of cover shot?
Yeah, excuse me.
I'm
I know
unfamiliar
this
with
is an
what you're
alien
discussing.
concept to
Yeah.
most people now. I will say that since, at least I've noticed this at Worlds, I noticed this at PAX. Uh, the tables tend to be skewing more towards like less and less scatter and more
Mhm.
towards terrain pieces that have smoother edges. And this has helped a little bit uh, be able to get like some interactive shots with range 3+ units. It's gone from like never to like usually never.
Yeah,
Mhm.
But
it's
it's
like
still gone.
5% of the time or
Right.
something.
Um, but it's still hugely relevant when that happens.
Mhm.
So like if you can get an out of cover shot, which again, still pretty rare, less rare than it has been, and at least in my experience with tables as they people have adjusted. Um, is it worth it to move up and do that, or move sometimes to the side and do that versus just staying where you are and like aiming?
I mean, math wise, if all you care about is the efficiency, then yeah, like an aim's almost never going to give
Yeah.
you 2 hits. Certainly on app, like it might if you reroll 2 blanks into 2 hits, but like average wise, it's not. Versus heavy cover is always going to take off 2 hits. Um, but obviously there's more to consider than just that, because if are you overextending? Are you getting away from the rest of your army? It depends.
Yeah,
The answer at the end of the day is always it depends. But
it
I
depends.
mean, 2 hits, it's what would you do if you could
It's
just say,
not
hey, I add two
really two
hits?
hits though. It's like one hit in difference on average, right? It's the difference between aiming and moving, which on average
That's
an
fair.
aim token
Yes,
is going to
exactly.
be
Yes.
roughly equivalent
One
to
hit.
one hit,
Yep.
right?
Yes.
So on average, you're gonna make them roll one extra defense die, assuming that you're gonna take an aim action instead of moving.
Yes, which is not
Obviously,
necessarily guaranteed, but
right. Um, but I think for the purposes of this question, I think we can assume that that's what we're doing. I also think there's also a couple other things that I think are like relevant to the discussion. Is that the only aim token you have access to? Is like, are you supported by other units? I guess is maybe a more general way to put that question. So if you move, will you still be supported by those units? If yes, probably worth it. If no, probably don't do it. I think would be my general assessment of that.
gunlines are all about trading effectively. So if the trade is I receive one extra hit, you receive half my unit, as a result of me moving and positioning here, that's never going to be a good trade. If
Well,
it's
yeah.
Oh yeah, go.
No,
If
go
it's I
go for it.
receive one hit and I still get all the effects that I wanted to anyway, and nothing really changes, I'm not sacrificing all that much, then obviously that's a very good trade. So it depends.
Yeah, and I think kind of going back to like the examples we were using at the start, what you don't want to do is hang your unit out to dry. Like
Mhm.
it for going after this like little bit more juicier than a normal shot, right?
Mm-hmm.
If by going after that shot you are putting yourself in a position that you if your opponent did it to you, you would be like, let's
Mhm.
go. That's not a thing you should be doing just for efficiency. It's not
Yeah.
worth it.
Yeah. Generally, if you can move laterally and get that out of cover shot, it's going to be much less likely to end up exposing that unit than if you have to like move directly towards your opponent to get an out of cover shot. That's generally how I view it. Sometimes it's still worth it to move directly towards your opponent to get an out of cover shot. Um, but the calculus is much easier if you're not really changing, the to from range distance calculus to do that.
Yeah, and I also
Mhm.
think something that we haven't talked about really at all yet is the calculus of, yes, I could aim shoot, or I could move towards the objective and shoot.
Yep.
And continue, one of the things I see a lot is people will aim shoot, and then they'll just like keep aim shooting until like, turn 5 or whatever. And at that point, all of a sudden they've got to like move their units twice to get to the objectives that they need to get to. And I think it's important to, like, once you have started the engagement, moving and making sure that your units can easily get to the things that they're going to need to get to while still shooting every turn is a vital concept to be able to kind of implement in closing out the gunline game, right? You can be really good at shooting and you can be really good at projecting threat areas, but if at the end of the day, the last 2 turns of the game, you can't shoot because your units have to move, you're going to be in trouble no matter how much damage you did, unless you blew them off the table completely, which shouldn't have probably happened.
Yeah, KP is the clearest example of this kind of thing because it only scores once at the end of the game. But I see a lot of people doing what you're describing, where they're so focused on killing stuff that they end up in a position where, maybe they don't have to double move 2 turns in a row, but maybe they have to double move on turn 6. Whereas their opponent has kind of already inched toward that objective and they're already on top of it or very close to it, to the point where they can either just sit there all there because they're there already, or they just have to do a single move. And then you're in a position where all your units are doing nothing but moving, and your opponent is moving and attacking your units, possibly suppressing them. And that is usually a disaster for the player that has to just spend their entire turn moving versus the one that can still make attacks. So,
and to tie it into the last discussion about out of cover shots, that's actually probably one of the main situations where this, moving forward aggressively can be rewarding out of cover shots. If you think of like, we've got a big piece of terrain area, whatever, something, even just a barricade near the middle, and moving up, you're getting closer to the objective, but also you move up, you touch it, and now it was getting between you and the other units. Now you get to ignore it for all your shots, and as they have to now approach, you're just shooting them in the open. So it can be like double whammy. Like, I'm getting close to the objective. Now I'm shooting you in the open and you're not shooting me back. If you did, I'd still have cover, but you can't because you don't have the actions to do so.
Yep.
And I think it's interesting, we were talking about the like advantages of like moving to get an out of cover shot versus like staying and like aiming, right? And it's like roughly plus 1 hit, plus or minus, right? Moving forward and shooting as opposed to aiming shooting is also plus or minus 1 hit as far as like how it should affect your calculus and thinking, right? Generally. Like, it's not that much less effective than taking the aim token.
All right, any other general considerations?
I'm sure the answer to that question is yes.
Yeah, there's something.
I know this is a very broad topic.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, we've talked about it, I think, twice in 3 months or whatever, and I think the discussions have actually been pretty different.
Yep.
And I think we could talk about it 2 or 3 more times, and they probably continue to be pretty different. I think I think one of the things that I would like to caution everyone in the room about is that everything is about to change as to how these gun lines feel with the addition of range troopers and clone commandos.
Yep.
Some of the stuff might not be as practically relevant anymore. Some of it will be. I haven't played with the stuff enough to know which things will and won't be. The general rules and principles of range brand threats will continue to always be a thing, but the difference between them operating at range 3 and range 4 are pretty significant. So
it's big.
Range 3 maybe is the new range 2.
Yeah, there's a reason we were kind of talking about range 3 a lot in this episode, and that's because traditionally range 3's kind of been like that gunline sweet spot, and beyond range 4, like you've got crit plinking, right? You've got best case maybe a Shore T21B. You've got your Rebel DLTs, your ES5s, exactly. Your Magna Rocket again was one of the better ones at this, but you're pushing like a couple crits through at range 4, not full dice pools like we're about to see, right? Like my favorite thing with Clone Commandos is fire supporting with an RPS. You don't usually see 5 red, black, white coming to you with Pierce from range 4. You don't even see that from range 3 all that often. Where it's
no,
like,
you don't.
Okay.
And that's a solid dice pool. Like
it's a solid dice pool.
It's like AAT solid with Pierce backup, right?
With Pierce. That also conveniently has critical 2, impact 2 Pierce in case anyone's running armor. And again, that solving that so it solves the armor case of gunline weakness well. It doesn't solve the mobility. In the case of commandos specifically because of their action economy, but that's what metas are for. Figuring out what can I chance for the matchup, what do I have to really account for?
Yeah, I'll be curious to see. I know we're moving away from abstract general gunline discussion here, but briefly just to talk about commandos, I'm going to be curious to see how much the fact that they basically can't move actually limits them, because they do have infiltrate, and range 4 is pretty darn far. So it's possible that they can just kind of stake their claim on the area that they need to be and just drop there and be like, all right, this is where we're going to be this game.
That's pretty much been my experience. And they have because they exist in GAR, they have enough defensive tech that they aren't necessarily feeling like, oh dang, I got to use distance to be effective, or to be safe, because okay, you shoot me anything that's shooting them at range 4, they can kind of like, the dice pools are big, but they still are not necessarily as big as some of the range 3. Like think of like a 6-man pike unit that's throwing 6 black, no, 7 black and a red. We're not seeing that quite at range 4, but we're seeing pretty big dice pools, but they're not quite big enough that you can't be like, okay, cover, shield, guardian, barrier, whatever,
shared
dodges.
Yeah.
Just
if it goes
just
really,
make it
really wrong, you pop Katarn armor, like.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I also think that while I think they do look pretty stationary on paper, I don't think it's unreasonable to end up getting them into range 2 if you've already got them forward deployed and the enemy is like walking into the rest of your army.
Yeah, I'm also not sure that their range 2 pool is actually that much better, especially if dodges are involved.
Yeah, but I think perhaps the more important thing is they can't use their range 3 and 4 pool at range 2.
Yeah, I guess I'm just not. I'm saying like if you're at range 2, at least in my opinion, it's probably not because you like intended for them to be there.
It's not something you should seek out generally.
Unless maybe you're going after a vehicle or something where obviously the range 2 pool against armor with their grenade launcher thing or whatever it's called is going to be significantly better. But the normal basic black white pool is not really going to be that much better against most targets than just throwing those high velocity rifles.
No, but I do think that like in the situations that we were just talking about where you need to actually move forward like onto an objective, like that's when that pool is going to be relevant, right? It's like, okay, it's turn 5, and would I like to sit here and take 2 actions to shoot? Yeah, but if I do that, like they're out of the game.
Right.
So they got to move forward, right? And at least they still have something to use at that point, I think.
Yeah, the most relevant consideration there is going to be that their basic range tool pool doesn't require them to recover to use it.
Right, exactly.
It's just there.
It's just there.
Yep. All right.
Yeah, we'll see.
Well, enjoy your marginally warmer weather up there, Matt.
Yeah,
Is
exactly.
this like swimming season now in Norway? The water's probably still like just above freezing, but I know that
I don't,
people get a
yeah,
little
I don't,
crazy there with the jumping in cold water. So
they do. That's not really my thing.
I thought this was a joke.
no, I'm
Oh,
100% not joking.
no, like jump in a sauna and then jump in the cold water. Yeah, we were in Finland in January and we lived the sauna life, but um there was like a heated pool. It was like, whatever, 5 degrees or so. Like um and then there was the like ice cold pool. And my wife was like, "Oh, I want to jump, after being in the sun. Oh, I want to jump in the cold pool, like live the true Finnish experience." And then she probably put like maybe 2 toes in, and then decided this is not a good idea. Like I maybe if that's something you do a lot, I can see it feeling good, maybe, but I'm a coward. Not for me. Not for me at
Same,
this point.
same. Supposedly it's very good for your cardiovascular system, but
Yeah. Until it gives you a heart attack because it's such a shock to the
right,
system.
yeah. I mean, your body can get used to it, apparently. I have a friend
Yeah.
who married into a Scandinavian family, and a lot of their traditions have rubbed off on him. And he's like, "Yeah, I can get up to like 10 minutes in near freezing water now." And I'm like, "That sounds horrible."
Yeah, like why?
It is a Norwegian thing. They do condition the kids from a young age as well. Like they'll leave them outside sometimes at like I've heard about this and I've heard it been like, yeah, it's more than just like an urban myth. I haven't necessarily like seen it. Maybe it's just not cold enough around here or I'm not downtown enough. But like go into the coffee shop, leave your kid outside in the stroller in the cold. Not like super, super cold, obviously, but like condition them slowly. So that's
This
a thing.
sounds like child abuse.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be. I
Is it
mean,
child
look.
abuse or is it setting them up well for later in
Yeah,
life? They're
there's
not
a
going to
lot
remember
of
it.
stuff that is considered child abuse these days that 20 years ago was not.
Yeah,
I'm not condoning any of it, just to be clear,
yeah,
but I'm just saying.
sure. I don't want to touch that rail on a Legion
If if
podcast, but
if a kid comes and plays Legion and I'm using a Dark Trooper list, is that child abuse? This
maybe
is
depends on
maybe a
what
relevant
country you're in.
question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, we are the Notorious Scoundrels. I'm Kyle.
I'm Mike.
I'm Matt.
Stay fresh, cheese bags.